Welcome to Converging Dialogues podcast. I'm Xavier Bonilla. In today's episode, I am talking to Ben Winegard. Ben Winegard is an assistant professor at Hillsdale College, where he teaches developmental and evolutionary psychology. Ben has been interested in evolution, human progress, and polarization as of recently within history and politics. In this episode, we talk about a variety of things. We talk about experts and their use and limits. We talk about epistemic humility and why it's okay to say I don't know for a lot of things. We talk about the role of institutional pragmatism, which is super important for human progress and how we do things within society. We talk about the working class and transforming liberalism. And we talk about moderate centrism, being more radical and speaking out within their own respective parties, and many other topics. Ben is a good guy. We engage a lot online, and this was a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed it, and look for his podcast with his brother Ben Winegard, which I had on my podcast last week. So without further ado, I bring you Ben Winegard. All right, I am here with Ben Winegard. Ben, how's it going?
Not too bad.
It's good to have you on the podcast. Thank you for taking some time to chat about some important things. So I suspect we have a few things to hit.
Yeah, there's a little bit going on in the world right now.
Right. Okay, so why don't, there's obviously plenty of people that know who you are, and there's plenty of people that don't know who you are. Just give me your kind of potted biography, kind of your snapshot of where you come from in terms of your interest and your expertise and where you're at now and kind of some of your future projects that you got going.
So my background is in, I would say, mostly evolutionary psychology. I majored as a sociologist in undergraduate studies, was not happy with the identity politics and kind of wokeism in sociology. So, because I already had kind of an evolutionary perspective at that point, but it didn't go well with some of the professors at Grand Valley State University where I was studying. So I switched to psychology, applied to specifically to work with evolutionary psychologists as advisors. I went to the University of Missouri in Columbia to work with Dave Geary in graduate school. And then after my dissertation, I got a job at Carroll College in Helena, Montana, stayed there for 3 years, and got a job at Hillsdale College. So all the way back to Michigan, where I'm from, and this is my third year at Hillsdale. In terms of my kind of interests moving forward, I would say kind of an evolutionary understanding of human nature is a perennial interest of mine. Polarization is something that I'm getting more into just because I think that's one of the most important issues for not just kind of political unity, but also just kind of building a functional society where we can actually solve important social issues. So probably do more work on polarization. And I'm always interested in history, kind of broad topics that I will never be an expert in, but I like being a dilettante and kind of dipping my feet a little bit.
Sure, yeah.
So that's the brief version.
Yeah, no, it's great. That's great. I think maybe that's a nice setup for some of the things I've thought about more recently, and is, I'm in the clinical psych world, right? So that's my playground, and you're, as you just said, you do the evolutionary psych background, and so I guess in some ways, some people could ask, okay, well, why are two psychologists talking about politics and talking about society and talking about, I mean, we're not poli-scientists. We're not, I guess strictly, I mean, you have a background in sociology, but not strict sociologists. We're not economists. Why is it, I guess, important for people in our field to have some sense of a say in some of these things?
It's a good question. I mean, I guess from the most kind of generic answer would be it's important for any citizen to have some sort of understanding about what is happening in his or her nation, community, state, when we're talking about a federalist system.
Mm-hmm.
So I think anybody should kind of take an interest in what's happening politically, current events, even if that's just at the local level. That's something that people should take an interest in. In terms of psychology proper, I do think that there is an expertise that psychologists have in how the mind brain works and human nature, and that influences politics. I mean, if somebody comes out with what they consider some evidence-based solution to a particular social problem and it's incongruent with our best understanding of human nature, I don't think that's going to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you think of the entire discipline of behavioral economics is this, kind of attempt to say, yeah, these rational economic models approximate, human decision making. However, you have to take into account some of these cognitive biases and these heuristics that humans actually use that we've learned through like people like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky and Richard Thaler, that humans do have these departures from perfect rationality. So that's an area of expertise they have. And I believe that we have some expertise that can be brought to bear on questions of, broad social problems, if you will.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think usually my answer is somewhat similar to yours is, with psychology, we're interested in the human psyche. You said the brain and human behavior, and how that works within a variety of domains and disciplines. And why wouldn't we be interested in that? I mean, if you're quote unquote a specialist in human behavior, well then you should be concerned, I think, in human behavior within society, within political systems, within economics, within a variety of things. And so I think it's not you just have to, get people on your couch and listen to them tell you all your problems. That's one angle of psychology. But psychology, in my view, is a much broader lens in which to, understand ourselves, but understand people around us and people in society. So I think it's super important to have those discussions from how we see things.
Yeah, I agree, and I just add that I really just despise credentialism in general. So there is an empirical world. Some things are true about it. You can gain insight into that, and there's not this is the truth as the sociologist sees it. No, either that's accurate or it's not, and we can independently evaluate that using the best evidence, data, et cetera, that we have. So I just don't see why would a psychologist sit it out, right? Anybody can participate in that. We have all of the scholarship available. You can go on Google Scholar, you can read books, you can study these topics. I don't think having a PhD in political science, that doesn't mean that you're instantaneously better equipped to deal with, say, political polarization than a psychologist or even just a concerned citizen who has done a lot of research on the topic.
Yeah, I would mostly agree with that. I think that one of the things that, a PhD or any type of doctorate in principle offers is some kind of heuristic and or rubric for trying to understand some of the data that's given out. So in a certain program, when you're taught certain things, there's more of this. Well, how are you trying to understand empirical data? How are you able to understand basic statistics? How are you able to understand certain types of critical thinking? I don't think you need a PhD to have that, but I think it's just more of a kind of framework of how to approach data.
Yeah, so I would agree that just as a empirical matter, those who have advanced degrees in a particular topic are generally better suited to opine on those topics because they have usually a better understanding of the data and what implications it has. However, you don't have to, is I guess my point.
Yeah.
I don't think that if Noam Chomsky says something about foreign policy, for example, I'm not going to say, well, that's stupid because he doesn't have a PhD in international relations. It's either, it's independently of that. It's a good or a bad idea. And we would argue about the evidence, not his actual credentials.
Right. No, I agree 100%. And I think that kind of bleeds into the next point that I think you and I both are really interested in, is this type of epistemic humility that is required, I think, for a lot of people. So I think you can broaden this out, right? I think it's you can tie that in with quote unquote elites, but then I think in general, right? So I don't tell me your thoughts. Maybe you want to give us how you understand epistemic humility and kind of some of the ins and outs of it.
I think in the most basic sense, epistemic humility is having an understanding of your own limitations in terms of knowledge, and being able to apportion the strength of your belief to the evidence as well. So knowing that if I'm talking about a particular topic, I don't really have that much insight into it. But if I'm talking about another particular topic, let's say, sex differences in cognition, I have a pretty good understanding of that literature. So I feel pretty comfortable making certain claims, such as males on average have an advantage in three-dimensional mental rotation compared to females. So I think it is really kind of an understanding of your own limitations, both in terms of your ability level, but also in terms of the knowledge that you possess. Because a lot of domains, it's the epistemic humility is not, I'm not intelligent enough to understand it. It's I haven't put in the work to know enough about this topic to make strong claims. Just as one example, let's say healthcare.
Right.
Well, I understand that there are people who are much smarter than I am, who have spent the better part of their entire lives investigating comparative healthcare systems, or even just the ins and outs of Medicare and the pros and cons of Medicare for all, let's say. Those individuals I'm going to weight their opinion on that topic more than my own, right? And so I don't have a dogmatic view of healthcare. I would say my priors are some form of universal healthcare is probably better than what we currently possess, because I think that's the kind of expert consensus, and it seems to make sense to me. But I'm open to counter evidence in that particular domain, because I do recognize that I do not possess that expertise.
Yeah. And I think that I think it's a two-prong approach here of sorts, where it's, okay, so let's take you and I, for example, right? We both, have, doctorate degrees in, respective fields, or, essentially the same field, just different subsets. Even within my field, right? Even if it's something, a doctorate in clinical psych, I had an emphasis in neuropsych. I think the more, it's kind of that whole thing, right? Like the more you know, the more you realize you don't know anything at all. It feels that way sometimes.
Yes.
And people will come to me sometimes and they'll say, well, I mean, you're the expert here. And I'm like, I'm always telling people, look, I'm not an expert in dealing with kids with autism, or I'm not an expert in trauma. Like, there's something about that process wherein, yes, you're highly trained, you expert in the particular field, but there's this kind of, at least for me, a humility, but also a respect for it, which is, I don't know this. Mm. And even when I'm getting data, if you're trained well, you always want to, in a sense, hedge always before you really definitively say, okay, yes, like this is it, that we can definitely hang our hat on this. And so I think that applies outside of that, right? In terms of kind of like with your healthcare example, which is, I'm in the healthcare world, but I mean, I don't have a, public health degree. Like I haven't been working within government about the ins and outs of, Medicare or Medicaid.
Right.
So I'm going to lean on folks that do.
Yes. But
still have a type of like, okay, well, let's see what comes out. Let's see what's here. And I wonder, so this, all these topics are kind of bleeding together, but I wonder, what does it say about, what do you think it says about experts and non-experts, let's say, that I don't want to say can't do it, but definitely struggle to do this, right? Because there's a certain group of people that can say, look, I can recognize my limitations. I recognize what I don't know. Okay, let's be patient. Let's see what's coming out. And other people will just jump the gun and be like, nope, that's it. Game over, done. I believe this. You're not going to change my mind. This is how it is. And it's like, well, let's try and have some patience or humility here. And people just shut it down. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think on the psychological level, I mean, there are well-known individual differences in need for cognition, dogmatism, authoritarianism, and so on. So there are probably underlying psychological proclivities that people have that may predispose them to be more or less, let's say, intellectually arrogant. And also that's compounded with tribalism and polarization.
Yeah.
If I become a part of a particular political tribe, then the ideology of that tribe I embrace as my own. And I think that this is why it's incredibly important to have an environment where there is unabashed freedom of expression, discussion, speech, the bouncing ideas off of people. And that is done in a civil and respectful way, without, to the extent possible, the use of ad hominem, because there are always people who think that they know what the answer is. And unless they're exposed, publicly, that can be very damaging. And that's why I think, just to, we'll come back to this, but just to briefly touch on it, that's why I think that wokeism it can be incredibly damaging. If you have that kind of a view and it's completely takes over a institution, and people no longer challenge it, then it just becomes this kind of the oxygen that everybody is breathing, and that's not a good situation to be in, especially if it's suppressing alternative viewpoints and ideas.
Yes, it's like the epitome of like cultural groupthink. Yes. It's just like, this is it. This is what everyone thinks. That's what we're going to think. We're not going to challenge it. We're not going to play devil's advocate. We're not going to, do any of the things that are required to challenge, a type of, groupthink. I would agree with you on all of that. Okay, so let's jump into something that both of us, I think, feel passionate about. Now, I've told people, I said, look, I'm trying to not make my podcast too parochial, right? I don't want it to be politics all the time, but I do have an interest, and I do think it's super important, based on what we've talked about thus far. So let me just ask, where do you put yourself nowadays politically?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would probably at this point identify as an institutionalist and a pragmatist. And that would probably, I do use the term centrist from time to time, although I'm the first to admit that it's sometimes vacant of actual content when you say centrist.
Mm-hmm.
So I think institutional pragmatist might be the most accurate label. And because of that, and this is only something that's occurred in the last maybe 6 or so months, I've tried to cultivate a respect and even perhaps admiration for political figures from all over the spectrum who I feel embrace the best of institutional pragmatism. Susan Collins being one of them from the Republican side, Joe Manchin on the Democratic side.
Yeah.
There are other figures, of course. I think Joe Biden personally would fit in that. Whether the Democratic Party that he leads does is an entirely separate question. But
Yeah.
that's where I kind of fit, because I do think that tribalism and polarization are such nefarious forces that I don't want to identify with a particular political party anymore.
Yeah, just for the listeners, how do you define pragmatic institutionalist? That might be a new term for some people.
Oh, yes, good question. So institutionalist to me is just somebody who has respect for the norms, values, and rules of extant institutions. And to the extent that they disagree perhaps with those norms and rules and values and expectations, they're willing to settle those disagreements through existing institutions, or very prudently if they're going to create some kind of alternative institution. So having, let's say that you're a senator, I think respect for the Senate means that you actually attempt to get legislation passed, you attempt to compromise on that legislation, reach across the aisle. You're not using the filibuster gratuitously. You're not a political entrepreneur who's pulling political stunts and going on MSNBC or Fox News just to, score partisan points,
right.
etc. So it's a broad term, but I think we could say on this continuum of, let's say, non-institutionalist to institutionalist, you can identify figures there. So you could say
Sure.
Ted Cruz is not an institutionalist, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's a political entrepreneur who is building a personal brand and not respecting the Senate, the kind of normal rules and values that institution and companies. Whereas Susan Collins would be more on the institutionalist continuum.
Mm-hmm. And do you find that most institutionalists typically are pragmatic, more moderate in temperament and in approach?
Yeah, almost by nature, I think that that's the case, because you're not, your goal is to make that institution and the institutional framework actually provide concrete results.
Mm-hmm.
And to do that requires pragmatism, right? Nobody gets everything that they want, especially if you're talking about, complex institutions that have individuals who possess, different goals, different values. So you have to sublimate some of your personal ambitions to the kind of good of the institution, and recognize that you're probably not going to get everything you want. And that's just kind of how it works. And that's true even if you're in, a private business for that matter, right? If you work at Amazon, you're not going to get, people are not going to approve every idea that you have. That's just not how it works.
Right.
So, you play by the rules, you do the best that you can, you work with your colleagues, and you make compromises along the way. And I would say, actually, in my view, one of the things that's happened in the last, let's say, like 30 or so years that's just really unfortunate is that a lot of individuals have decided, rather than, let's say in the media, rather than trying to reform some of the problems that media institutions have from the inside, they've decided that it's better just to create an alternative institutional framework, a kind of ecosphere where they don't have to compromise. And because of that, now you have essentially just tribal media, right? It's MSNBC, Fox News, talk radio, Breitbart, and so on. Now, that's not all bad. I do think that there's a role for partisan media, but I do think it's bad if everybody who has a problem with the New York Times decides, well, I'm not going to work there, or I'm not going to read the New York Times. Instead, I'm just going to create this institution or work for this institution that agrees with me 100% of the time.
Yeah.
Right. Because then just by process of selection, the New York Times becomes more and more woke. Right. And
nobody's it's an echo chamber.
Yeah, exactly. Nobody's going to counter that narrative within the institution.
Yeah. So why for you, I guess, is the emphasis on institutions, right? Because I can already hear, probably 74 million, arguments against, institutions, right? And they're inherently evil. They're, really, they're racist, they're fallible, they're, there's just, all of these criticisms of, that's the reason why, it's insider politics, this is just, there's nothing, we need outsiders to push it. Why for you, the emphasis on institutions?
Well, I think if you look at just most generally, if you look at the broad sweep of history, life is getting better. That's just undeniable.
Right. This is Steven Pinker's argument. Yeah.
Steven Pinker, Michael Shermer has written a book on this. There's a website called Human Progress. You can look at all of these indicators. It's just really undeniable that the broad sweep of history is toward, with some exceptions, toward the improvement of human life, life expectancy, literacy rates, health, subjective well-being, and so on.
Poverty, the whole thing.
Poverty, yes. So how has that happened? Well, it didn't occur because individuals pursuing their own interests separate from institutions made life better for everybody. It occurred because you had certain institutional frameworks that functioned well, where you can, concentrate knowledge, have innovation occur. That, for example, take like science. Science is institutional. One individual is not going to, we have this romantic notion of, Newton, he just came up with all the laws of motion and gravity on his own. Right. That's not how normal science doesn't work that way, right? It's an institutional framework where you have a peer review process, you have a vetting process to create a group of experts who understand their disciplines, who read other experts and make judgments about their work, and you get criticism, right, and pushback, and it's an iterative process. Outside of the institutional framework, science doesn't work. It just doesn't. Right. So if you're going to reform science, like say the open science framework to address the replication crisis, they're creating institutions that work within the already extant institutional framework, right? They're not saying, well, we're just going to do our own thing. Right. Because I think Brian Nozick and other individuals in the OSF and that movement recognize that, no, you're not talking about being a nihilist and burning the institutions down. You're talking about prudentially reforming them. And so I think you can apply that most generally, that look, institutions functioning reasonably well, guiding human behavior, lead to good outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, it is important that we work within those institutions. That is, if we actually care about human well-being, which I do. I care
Mm-hmm.
about that much more than I care about some revolutionary slogan, let's say.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. And so, I mean, yes, I think that's entirely what it is, because you're replicating, I think, what naturally occurs with kind of man-made hierarchies, right?
Mhm.
Is that we're building hierarchies, we're building systems to try and generate more efficiency with a bunch, 8 billion of us on the planet. I don't know how you would be able to do that otherwise. And I don't know how you have human progress or human growth without that in some ways.
I don't think that you could have human progress or growth. When you think about the tremendous coordination problems that societies face, think about all of the individuals pursuing their own interests on a single day in the city of Chicago, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
How does that get coordinated at all to lead to reasonable outcomes such that most people living in the city of Chicago are secure and able to go about their normal lives?
Mm-hmm.
You have all of these institutional frameworks that help guide individuals in their behavior. And I think the capitalist institutional framework is the most successful in the history of humanity.
Yes.
Because it really tames self-interest in such a way that it often, not always, but often leads to positive externalities and actually human improvement.
Mm-hmm.
But even let's say in politics, well, everybody has their own parochial interest, and they can't
Sure.
just go pursue that with no constraint. Otherwise, you just get, unfettered tribalism, and
Yes.
that's not good for anybody.
And so, I mean, I can definitely hear how I don't see, because I think it is sort of inherent in it, how you don't take a moderate pragmatist approach. And so within the framework in which you've explained, if we agree that institutions, man-made institutions or, anything else, are the ones that are driving human progress, and we have enough global and historical data at this point to point to that and say, yes, on all metrics, more or less, everything has come down from how high it was in terms of, all the things we just listed. And if that's the case, pragmatic, moderate use of institutions creates better well-being for humans. And in that way, I think this is the biggest and most fundamental point against progressivism, politically or anything else, is, to me, there's a lot of healthy ideas, I would say, in progressivism, but it's all ideology, or excuse me, all idealism. That's all it is. And you can have those ideals, but it's one of those things where it has to be anchored in efficiency. It has to be anchored in practical ways of doing it for a diverse populace. And in that way, I don't see how you couldn't do that with some form of moderate, pragmatic ways of doing things through institutions.
Yeah, so to me, it's basically like there's a role for people to be progressive idealists or for them to be conservative idealists. But if you're thinking about a concrete issue, let's say that your goal is to, curb carbon emissions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how are you going to instantiate that goal? you kind of have to ask yourself, how are we actually going to do this?
Mhm.
And if you ask yourself that question, you think about it, then I think the rational person, they have to assess what is the best tactical way to achieve that goal. And usually, not always, but usually it's through existing institutions and through maybe, writing letters to your representative, maybe getting involved in a particular movement. Whatever it is, I think if you're really concerned about that, you do become pragmatic and moderate, and you're also a liberal pluralist because you recognize that other people might make different decisions than you do, or they care about different issues than you do. I think that's also important.
Yes.
So if let's say you care about polarization, how can we concretely do something about it? Well, first, don't participate in it. So that's some advice that I need to take for myself.
Are you suggesting people should have self-control, or is that what you're suggesting? How dare you?
Well, it is a real problem because the incentives there are kind of out of whack. Like on Twitter, you're rewarded for being as polarizing and inflammatory as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that, everybody falls prey to that temptation to fire off that snarky tweet that is overly polarized and really doesn't represent an accurate, it's not indicative of your actual beliefs, right?
Yeah.
So you have to, one thing is just kind of dial back on that a bit. But the other thing I think is, when I'm thinking, okay, well, how can we concretely decrease polarization? Well, being a diehard member of a particular political tribe doesn't seem like a good way to do that. And that's why I really wanted to kind of step back and just think about, I could support different politicians from different political parties who I think embody the values that I have, and encourage them to compromise and work with each other.
Yes.
So I don't have any patience for people like AOC, because that's not what she's doing, right? And her shtick probably works with her constituents in Brooklyn, but it's not going to play with most people in Illinois or Ohio or Iowa. Right?
Yeah, she's the other extreme, and I want to clarify this. I'm not comparing her to Ted Cruz. I am not doing that. But it's like we were saying earlier, right? These aren't institutionalists. They don't want to use institutions. It's their brand.
Right.
It's pure political narcissism of trying to say, how do I have my brand for whatever my goals are? And they both do identity politics. I mean, Ted Cruz does identity politics to the max, right? I mean, this guy would, sell his firstborn child if he could be president. I mean, that's just, he's just that power hungry.
Yes.
And in an analogous way, I think AOC is the same way. I mean, listen, she's great on social media. Don't get me wrong. I mean, she's great on social media, but all of her values and her morals and all that stuff, I mean, it's a way of trying to get to whatever her end game is, right? Not, do I think she actually cares about some of that stuff? Sure, I think she does.
Yes.
But it's not about, in my view, hearing other people's opinions. It's not about hearing the right and hearing what they have to say, or moderates. It's, bend to my platform, and if you don't, then I don't need you. And in that way, there's nothing pragmatic about it. And there's nothing that is using the institutions that, this country has created. So it's like, it's fine. She's an extremist with a large megaphone. That's okay. Like, that's an angle, but I don't see it as very helpful, overall.
And that's where I think the liberal pluralism is important, because if you have a group of really woke, diverse, urban constituents, then a lot of her social views will resonate with them. So if that's what you want to do in Portland or Seattle or Brooklyn, okay. But I don't think that you should try to force that on people who live in, let's
Des Moines.
say, Des Moines, or even to take a more extreme example, let's say Escanaba in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
Let those people live in a community that reflects more of their values, even if you think that they're unenlightened.
Yeah.
Right? That's okay.
Right.
Not everybody has to agree with you. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of cultural imperialist impulse really disturbs me.
Mm-hmm.
And so you think like this is where I think, let's take Joe Manchin. He's kind of informative. So
Mm-hmm.
what do you think that Joe Manchin represents the state of West Virginia?
Yes.
They went Trump in 2016 by, I think, 40%.
Mm-hmm.
I think in 2020, they went Trump by about 38%, maybe.
It was slightly lower, I think, but.
Okay, yeah, but above 30%.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, they have very different values than somebody who lives in Brooklyn does. And if you want a political party that encompasses both Joe Manchin and AOC, you're going to have to compromise on that. No, there are certain, I think, inalienable rights that will exist in both West Virginia and Brooklyn. I don't think you should
Certainly.
allow slavery in West Virginia, for example.
Right.
But they're going to be very much, like more religious. They're going to have different views about climate change. They're going to have different views about abortion, gay marriage, the extractive industries, etc.
Right.
And we have to find a way to have people with these different views living together and working together and allowing each other to, live and thrive in the same country, in the same political party, etc.
Yeah, and so I think this blends in nicely with, I think one of the bigger topics here is how, in my view. So let me back up a little bit. For my audience, Ben is a twin for my previous guest last week, Ben Winegard. So they are identical twins. They have indistinguishable voices, as you can all tell. I'm going to listen back to this and be like, hey, am I listening to the
right?
But he was making the argument last week, about a brand of conservatism that is, I've been center left for a long time. Most days I'm in the center. Some days I'm center left on some issues, center right. It was not objectionable to me at all. Right. And it doesn't, do I think the rest of the right buys into that?
No.
Nowadays, probably not. I don't know. But I guess for me, liberalism, at least in a classical sense, has always, or I guess you could say in the modern era, modern being past 50 to 70 years, post World War II, has had the better answers to a lot of problems in the United States. That's just my view. Now, people may disagree with me on that. That's fine. And I think that's what's so particularly frustrating for me, and I don't know how it is for you, let's just take the historic left. The left, in principle, has, I think, better ways, better policies, better ideas, that it is this kind of more liberal pluralism. I think that is there, right? I don't see as much of that with conservatives, although that's sort of kind of changing in some ways. And I think this being pulled into the wokeness has completely torpedoed that.
Yes.
So the big thing that is, I think, most illuminating, right, particularly arresting, is this de-emphasis on the working class. And some people say, well, what is this, like almost this fascination, this fetishizing of this one particular voting block? There's other people we got to worry and be concerned about. And I think it's because, and you tell me what you think about this, that the working class is representative of all of those other categories, right? The working class is Hispanic, it's white, it's Black. Now, there may be nuances, but it's all of those people, right? And it's still a majority of the voting bloc. So I'll segue into the recent election here. I'll give you an example. I went back and was looking at Wisconsin, your neighboring state.
Yes.
And in 2008, right, I was looking at the map, right, when Obama won that state. It was completely blue, completely blue for the most part. You had suburbia, cities, rural counties. There was this blue wave. And then you see in 2012, granted, Mitt Romney was a more moderate kind of Republican, a little bit easier for people to kind of be like, okay, I could do either or. So Obama lost some ground in Wisconsin, right? You see some of the more rural counties went for Romney, but he still won Wisconsin. Yes. And then in 2016, granted, Hillary Clinton abandoned and forgot the blue wall, but that was gone. Just gone. Like within 4 years, just absolutely gone. The only places were cities. And then you fast forward to this year. More or less, and what did Biden win Wisconsin by? 20, 30,000 votes?
Yeah, it's going to be like 20,000.
I mean, it almost was the same as what Hillary had, plus or minus two or three counties. And that's an example. I mean, it's a key state in some ways, but it's an example of the left and Democrats own this, right? They are part of the problem of not talking to people outside of cities. I mean, in the election, right? You had Tuesday night and the whole week, and everybody, each state was this over-reliance on voter turnout in cities. Like, that's a problem. That's a problem politically, but that's a problem, I think, in terms of culture of how is one party unable to effectively reach out beyond cities?
Well, so a few points. I mean, one thing is you could, so Biden did slightly worse as far as I'm aware, in most urban areas than Clinton did, because some of the Black vote went to Trump. He did much better in upscale suburban environments because he's going to do better with educated whites, which, kind of continues the trajectory of educated whites defecting from the Republican Party. So you can view that in myriad ways. One would be it's a failure of the Republican Party to keep their suburban voters. The other would be, well, the kind of, it also represents the Democratic Party completely jettisoning the rural counties. And I think both are correct and true and problematic. But on top of that, like if you look at it from, say, 30,000 feet, isn't the real issue there is this real polarization that's happening geographically, and that
keep going. Yeah, what do you mean by that?
So that you have polarization occurring ideologically, you have it occurring racially, you have it occurring occupationally, educationally, right? And so these mega identities form where if I'm an educated individual who's white, I identify with the Democratic Party. And you can also predict a lot of things about me just from the fact that I'm educated and I'm a Democrat. You can predict I live in an urban environment or maybe a college town. You can predict what kind of vehicles I'd probably drive, the foods I like, even the television that I probably watch, right? Which is kind of fascinating. And vice versa. And also religious beliefs, right, are very polarized now. So if that happens, and I agree that the Democratic Party and liberals have a lot of blame here, but it's not surprising to me that you lose the ability to speak with any authority to large swaths of Americans when you have that kind of lifestyle polarization occur, that you only appeal to, let's say, urban environments and upscale suburban environments if you're the Democratic Party, and you only appeal to rural voters if you're the Republican Party, right?
Yes, 100%. So how does, I mean, you could make the argument, I guess, both ways, but how does the appeal broaden then? Right? I mean, let's stay with the left for a minute. How do they broaden that appeal? I mean, it's going to politically hurt them, but it's not even politically, right? I think it just, again, hurts in general, right? Of like, you have to be better than just being predictable, right? Everything you just said, what car I drive, what TV I buy, where I live, all those things. How can you be, at least how can you say you're for, party of the people, or you want to reach all people, or you have a multi-ethnic coalition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, if you can't broaden that? I mean, how does that get fixed?
Well, that's an extremely good question. One thing I would just note that's somewhat tangential to this, but it is interesting because I was thinking about this with Trump. So usually if you lose an election, your party forgets about you, right? They view you as kind of a loser. Like
that's what happened with Clinton and Bush, and I mean, Obama's kind of the exception here, but
well, he had 2 terms though.
Well, yeah, you're talking about one-termers.
Yeah, so if you look at like an incumbent president who loses, or a candidate who was running against and they lose, they're usually kind of forgotten by their party. Most people move on, and you try to figure out a better way to move forward, more talented candidate. Like, so the Democratic Party after 1980, you moved away from Carter, right? And then, in fact, you had the kind of New Democrats, this attempt to compete with Reaganism. And after 2016, clearly the Democratic Party didn't have a lot of patience for Hillary Clinton, right? You lost. This was an eminently winnable election. What happened? Right. It's interesting that right now, the Republican Party is not doing the same with Trump. Instead, they're holding on to him. And I think there's a strategic logic there. And the strategic logic would run like this. The Republican Party has bled suburban voters, as we've noted. And they actually, surprisingly, Trump, it was a high turnout election where Trump actually turned out many more voters than he did in 2016. He activated a lot of low propensity voters. Right. Rural voters, right? He has a real interesting connection with a lot of these people who feel that they're the victims of redistributive injustice and they've been left behind. I think the average Republican, these political figures, they realize they don't have that same appeal. So what are they going to do without Trump? So without Trump, you don't reach those low propensity voters, but can you actually kind of get back into the suburban voters and the moderates? I'm not sure that you can. So they're kind of in a very interesting situation where I'm not sure what their move is going forward. Like it's an interesting question, exactly how you deal with that strategically.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that actually. I think that's right. I think I think that, and people can have positive certain opinions about what is this appeal for rural America,
Mhm.
for, this guy that's, you know, a con man, he's from New York City. I mean, it's just the complete, on the paper, antithesis of what most of these folks would do. These people are rugged, hardworking, blue collar, used to work on assembly, the whole thing. And Trump is the complete other universe from these people on paper, but he has this holding power. But that aside, I hadn't thought about the way, but I think that's absolutely right. Is it works really well, and in fact grows over 4 years. And I'm having these memories of the 2015, 2016 primary where, you had, goodness, how it was like 20, 22 candidates that were, and Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, all the people in the Republic, and they couldn't connect.
Mm-hmm.
Ted Cruz a little bit, right? But it couldn't connect. And I think it's the same on the other end. In a similar way, in 2020, you had all these people that couldn't connect, right? I think there was a lot of people that were just like, let's just vote for the guy that can beat Trump the best. But yeah, I don't know, if there's no Trump, who do the Republicans turn to?
Well, right. So I think the interesting thing there is that the Republican establishment and the elite, they did not understand the extent to which there was profound alienation with the party. Right after the Bush years, they just didn't recognize what the base desired. So you run a candidate such as Mitt Romney, who does reasonably well among suburban voters, but he doesn't. There was the 6-7 million so-called the missing white voter in the upper Midwest that he didn't resonate with, and Trump did.
Yeah.
So that really demonstrated that the Republican elite were at odds with a large part of their base, and Trump, for whatever reason, had the charisma to activate that base. But I suppose then the question would be, do you double down on this strategy of trying to build a populist, largely rural, multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition of the quote-unquote working class? Or do you try to move back a little bit toward the moderate suburban voters who you used to rely on more? And clearly they figure, I'm sure that they thought Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio would do well among those, that demographic, right? And I just think that you're moving in a direction where that's no longer possible, because probably most moderate suburbanites are going to be now members of the Democratic Party. They will move in that direction, and the Republicans will have to double down on the strategy of kind of digging deeper into low propensity voters in rural America. And I just on the Wisconsin front, it's interesting. There's a really good book by Catherine Kramer, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she was specifically looking at rural vote. It's called The Politics of Resentment. She was looking at rural voters in Wisconsin who voted for Scott Walker and what was his appeal, because of course, educated suburbanites and people in Dane County, let's say, could not understand what the appeal of this guy was. I mean, he's a Neanderthal who just attacks public sector unions. Like, what is the deal here? And I think,
for those that don't remember, Scott Walker was the governor of Wisconsin for 8 years, right? At least 4.
Yeah, they recalled him, and he won the recall election.
That's right.
And he was going to be the next Reagan. He flamed out really quickly in 2015 because it turned out that he was just not charismatic and not very intelligent either. Like he just
No.
was not a good candidate.
Mm-hmm.
But what she found is that there's this kind of rural consciousness that people in Wisconsin had. And it was really this strong view that the system didn't work for them, that they were the victims of redistributive injustice, that they didn't get their fair share. They were hardworking, real Americans who
Mm-hmm.
were getting punished by the elite in the state of Wisconsin. And, you know, that was in they had this view like public sector unions were part of that system. So these people, they have these cushy jobs, they get a lot of money, they have secure jobs, they don't have to work hard, they have pensions. Oh, you know, look at that person down the road who, you know, works as a teacher and they're part of the teacher union and they're building a pool in their backyard. Well, I can't afford that.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on there?
Right.
And so I think those voters have become increasingly alienated with not just the Democratic Party, but also the mainstream of the Republican Party. And they viewed Walker as their champion, and they viewed Donald Trump as their champion. This person who's not of the establishment, who speaks to me, who hates the people that I hate, who will fire off that tweet, you know, lambasting a politician or a Hollywood actor or an actress. This guy who says the Iraq war was a disaster right in front of Jeb Bush's face. Who else is going to do that? It's Donald Trump. Now, never mind the fact that Trump really just governed as basically a Paul Ryan Republican, you know, cut taxes on the rich, and corporations, strip regulations, attempted to repeal the Affordable Care Act. I mean, that was kind of half-hearted, but, you know, if it weren't for John McCain, that would have happened.
Yeah.
To set that to the side, what he stands for, like from an identity perspective, a very visceral level, is a big middle finger to the establishment, to the media, to wokeism. And there are a lot of people who really adore that message, and an individual who's willing to, or in their view, willing to present they view it as like he's talking straight with us. Again, never mind the fact that he's actually has a way more of a propensity to lie than any other politician does. That doesn't matter, right? Because it's the perception that he's telling you these truths about the corrupt elite and the swamp and the establishment.
And I think that's like, look, I don't live in the Midwest, right? But that, or you can broaden that. It's not just the Midwest, right? It's rural America for many places. But you know, I can understand that, right? Like I can hear that, and I can be like, I get it. Like I totally get it.
Absolutely.
You know, if I bring in my, you know, coastal elite lefty, you know, progressive friends, I mean, they can't even, you know, there's this gnashing of teeth as soon as you just start trying to explain something about how, I mean, we're not talking, you know, a couple of rural counties in West Virginia or something. We're talking about a huge part of the voting bloc. I mean, huge parts of the country that have some version of that sentiment.
Yes.
And so I guess it goes back to my point. My first point is how, I mean, you know, just you kind of just spitballing, like, how do you think liberalism and how do you think liberals and maybe the left in general broaden that appeal? How did they talk to the rugged, the plumber or the mechanic or, you know, the person working at, you know, whatever auto industry, or they're working wherever it's at, these kind of, you know, working in an agrarian environment, you know, how do they, because they used to do that. Liberals used to do that. And they could, I think about Bobby Kennedy, right? He didn't win, you know, he got shot and the whole thing, but, and to a lesser extent, his brother, who was terribly centrist, you know, these were also, I mean, legitimately wealthy. I mean, the Kennedys were legitimately like stupid, rich. And they had this, they were well traveled and all this, but they had this charisma about them, especially Bobby Kennedy as well, that they could do both.
Mm-hmm.
They get down in the South, they talk to black folk, they talk to, unions, they talk to, Cesar Chavez, they talk to, really a big wide coalition of, running essentially on economics and, some of the racial components of the day, and talking to working class people. And is it, again, how it's come from that, but then far from that, but then also how do you broaden that appeal again and do that? I mean, how does that happen? How can we find a way to do that?
Well, let's talk about. Let me throw out the what terrifies me, and then move into maybe how.
Please, tell me.
So what deeply concerns me is the way we actually deal with this. Is you have a competent, full-throated populist who speaks to these real grievances and this real resentment. And that figure could be a Tucker Carlson, it could be a Tom Cotton or a Josh Hawley, although neither of them possess the same charisma even that Trump possesses. So I don't know if they could resonate in the same way. Tucker Carlson could, though.
He definitely could, for sure.
I mean, he has a very, very kind of dark charisma, and I know people on the reactionary right on Twitter make fun of me for this. But
you just lost at least 100 followers when they hear this.
However, I really fear that that's what happens. Because that is a Tucker, a kind of right-wing cultural grievance politics combined with center-left populist economic politics, I think it could be extremely popular. And most people, let's be clear, the average person does not care about things such as procedural fairness or small d democracy or colorblind institutions or the actual mechanisms of how the Senate works. What they care about is, do policies get passed that I like, that speak to me? If they get passed, okay, fine. That's all I care about. I just want to win. Let's win. If you get Tucker or somebody, equivalent.
Somebody in that mold, yeah.
Yeah, if he ensconces himself in power, that individual definitely could corrode institutions and bend them to his will. Like Trump could, if he were at all competent. He's just not. He's extremely lazy and he's extremely incompetent. So he's not, he just can't do it. But the fear, the real fear about Trump, like say post-election, talking about how it's rigged, I understand that fear, because if you had a competent figure, they probably couldn't pull a coup off, but they could definitely do a lot of damage. So I really fear what happens is Democrats kind of ride with Biden for these 4 years, and then maybe Harris runs in 2024, and you run against a real competent authoritarian populist, and the Democratic Party gets absolutely smashed. Right.
I think that happens before then. I mean, I was just looking before we got on here. At the moment, 10 seats have flipped in the House from Democratic seats to Republican all over the United States. And there's still some outstanding ones, which would, it could put it upwards of 15 to 17. The Democrats maintain a majority in the House, 218, but it actually might end up being 218 to 212, not the, thinking they're going to pick up seats and it's going to be 190 something to 2 whatever. That is also, I think we don't have to wait till 24. I think I think that's going to happen in 22, but then also in 24, you're right. If they coalesce around someone that just has a better political work ethic and is less of a narcissist, and someone that's somewhat more charismatic in a sense than Trump, I mean, I agree with you. I think it could be a slaughter, political slaughter.
So let me just say that for whatever reason, I'm not as concerned about the House losses this year, maybe as you are.
Why so?
Well, so kind of a technical reason. So in 2018, I think part of the reason that the Democrats were able to gain so much in the House is because they had a really, really active base in a lot of purple or reddish districts, and Donald Trump wasn't on the ballot. So the Republicans didn't turn out. In 2020, Donald Trump was on the ticket, so he pulled a lot of Republican voters who didn't vote in 2018. And many of these districts just have more Republican than Democratic voters. So it's just a matter of who turns out more. That said, I mean, I personally would have preferred that they picked up seats than that they lost them. But I do think that, yes, the real concern is 2024. What happens in 2024? And how do we prevent our institutions from being corrupted? And how do we, we're not running smoothly as it is, right? So how can we restore these institutions and prevent something like Tucker from happening, let's say? And to do that, I do think that you need to be able to speak to the real grievances that are out there, the real hurt and pain. And one area where we can see this is with, let's say, with what's happening with the coronavirus. This is why it maddens me to no end when you see hypocrisy among public health experts and politicians here, because you're asking people to make real difficult sacrifices. Let's say you own a small business in northern Michigan and a stay-at-home order gets put in place. Right. You very well could lose that business. That's absolutely a huge, right? That's this huge sacrifice. Maybe you saved for your income for 20 years to open that.
Right.
Okay, well, if you're asking somebody to potentially lose their business, and you're going to go and march in a Black Lives Matter protest and talk about the importance of racial justice, not surprising that that person is going to be upset with the establishment.
Yes, right.
So I think step one would be do not engage in hypocrisy, right? Be honest with people and transparent and live up to your rhetoric. My personal view, I don't think that this is going to happen, but my preference would be that political elites in both parties set aside divisive culture war issues in favor of bread and butter economic issues.
Yes.
For what I think one very important reason for that is on economic policy, it is not zero sum. Right, you can make compromises that benefit different constituents, and it can be a win-win. We can spend money in rural counties to help with the opioid epidemic, and we can try to, rebuild Detroit. Let's say some areas in Detroit. So you can help with racial justice, and you can help with the opioid epidemic. When you talk about a culture war issue, it is zero sum. If you play to this identity group, another identity group is going to view that as a loss. And there's not really a good way to compromise on that. There just isn't, right?
Yeah, I mean, you and I are, identical on this. And we've talked about this before, offline about, and I think I mentioned this with your brother too, is culture wars have to be dealt with in society. I don't want my governor and my, and the president and more or less, some senators and representatives, being, activists 24/7 in on Capitol Hill. Like, I think that there's policy issues that will arise from activism within culture, right? Okay, fine. That's, and then they hash it out and you get an element of that. Mm-hmm. And I think this just goes to your hypocrisy point, is because people are pulling, you have different politicians and certain elitist people that are pulling they're doing this utmost virtue signaling, right? Mm-hmm. And they're abandoning the infrastructure. How do we deal with certain drug abuses? How do we deal with healthcare? How do we deal with education? How do we deal with climate? How do how do automation? How things are going in the future? Mm-hmm. That, I think that's what many people in the sense want. I don't think they want, the president talking 24/7 about, whatever cultural issue is of the day. I don't think you should put your head in the sand and not say anything about it, right? I mean, obviously there's issues, but, and this is, I'll point to this piece, people forget, I always laugh at, some of my Trump friends that say this. It's like, the media is so tough on Trump, which is strange to me. I don't know why people feel so bad about it. It's a politician. Like, I don't feel bad for politicians getting heat from the media. I just don't feel bad about it.
Especially not somebody who violates as many norms as Trump does. But yes.
Right. And I remind people, I'm like, it's kind of always been that way. I think the advent of social media and how it is kind of creates a, more immediacy or whatever. But I mean, do people really forget how the media treated Bill Clinton during a sex, scandal? Do people forget how the media treated, George Bush endlessly? I mean, they just
also
brutalized this guy.
At this point, it really doesn't even make that much sense to refer to the media, right? Mm-hmm. Like, what are we talking about? So if you're talking about establishment prestige media, New York Times, Washington Post, CBS, CNN, okay, that's meaningful and we could talk about that. But if you just say the media, well, that includes Fox News is incredibly influential.
Oh, yeah.
Breitbart. Mm-hmm. OAN is trying to make a go at it, right?
Right, yeah, they are.
So what I think that activists on both sides in the base of the party do really like the culture war stuff.
Sure.
Right. So I think it would be misleading to say that people don't like that. The MAGA voters love.
Oh, it's entertaining. It's sensationalism.
Right. And they also, so there's a collective action problem, right? Because you could imagine, let's say, two kind of Trumpy candidates. One would be Tucker Carlson, and the other is, let's say, Steve Bullock. Mm-hmm. Okay. They have the exact same economic programs. Mm-hmm. Like, we're going to spend $2 trillion on infrastructure, higher minimum wage, public option in healthcare, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But Bullock just promotes this kind of minimalist nationalist narrative of we're all Americans, we love our country, I'm a patriot, that's what unites us. Right. Tucker does that plus the kind of rural grievance politics. Well, who wins? Answer is obvious.
I mean, Tucker wins.
Tucker wins that
every day, twice on Sunday.
Exactly, right. It's really frustrating because it would be better for our nation if Bullock would win that contest.
Of course.
But from the point of view of individual incentives, I understand why somebody who's going to culture war it will enter the primary and will win. And this is where it used to be the case that having strong political parties helped with this, right? Because mm-hmm. they would prevent these kind of very just deleterious demagogues from rising to power. Right. Because if you were a political party, if you're the Republican Party, you're concerned about general elections, not who can win our primary.
Yeah.
And your calculation was, well, a figure that divisive can't win a general election. Like, they're just not going to be able to. So we're going to go with the more milquetoast candidate. And, mm-hmm. and we'll go with George H.W. Bush and not Patrick Buchanan,
Right.
right? Or if you're the Democrats, we're going to go with Bill Clinton and not Jesse Jackson,
Right.
etc.
But now it's reversed, right? I mean, it seems that way. I mean, Trump is the one piece of it. I mean, and let's see what the left does if they, at some point, Biden's the last true Democrat, and it's just run over by, I don't know. I mean, because I think the RNC and DNC hold the most power in both cases, but Trump definitely was a moment of turning that, right? We don't want the milquetoast person. We're going to have the guy. I mean, and now it seems kind of to your earlier point, that he has a connection with those people, so they don't want to let it go.
And let's be very clear, since I was singing the praises of parties and the elite, there were very real failings, bipartisan failings among the political and economic elite that created legitimate grievances that Trump took advantage of. So, for example, immigration, there were very real grievances there. Trade policy, globalization, our response to automation, as you mentioned. And that's another thing where I think you really need liberal pluralism. You need vibrant local institutions that provide checks on this kind of cosmopolitan elite so that they recognize, well, look, like people are not doing well in large swaths of rural Montana, right? We need to do something about that. We can't just cater to Silicon Valley and Wall Street, right? And so I think if you had a more stronger mediating institutions would provide more of a check on the penchant of the kind of global elite to focus on policies that are very helpful to the educated, hyper-educated few, right? And I'm not sure what you do about that because I don't see those institutions getting rebuilt anytime. I just don't.
No, I don't. I'm with you. I don't see that at all either. I mean, I guess maybe this is it's a whole other can of worms, but I think it fits a little bit, and we haven't really touched on it, but we can maybe close with this. Is in my view, going all the way back to what we said in the beginning, I think we need pragmatic centrists on both parties to correct for the tribalism within each party with this polarization. I don't see another way that gets corrected for, because my optimism is this country is still deeply moderate, right? In many ways. I think there's, the MAGA cult, which is fine. But that doesn't mean 73 million people that voted for Trump, that they're all part of that, right? I think they voted. I think there's, a healthy percentage that, they're going to, they'll die with Trump on whatever he says. Okay, that's fine. That's their right. But there's a whole lot of other people that are like, I don't like the guy. But, I'm voting for my party. I don't like Joe Biden. I'm voting for this one issue, whatever. And I think in both cases, so people, moderates on the left and moderates on the right, and you see some of this, if that's the majority, right? If most people, people not on Twitter, most people in real life are fairly moderate centrists within their party, it to me, that says the way you correct for this stuff is those people have to be more loud in how they correct it. They have to, for as an example, for people on the left, they have to tell certain progressives, listen, those are some good ideas. We're not going to do all those. And they need to tell, the woke stuff, like, look, I see some of that, but we're not going to do all of that. We don't agree with all of that or the extent of it. Cut that shit out.
Yeah.
Calm down. We'll do some of this. And that doesn't mean that any all these other things, you can't say that, you can't talk about it, but that's not the left. right? Same thing on the right. People that are center right need to say, look, we cannot have somebody saying these things against our basic democratic institutions. Case in point, voter fraud, where there's no clear evidence of that. Like, Republicans should unanimously be saying, cut that shit out.
Mm-hmm.
Don't do that. We can file all of our, in court, due process, rule of law, things like that. To me, that's the case. And so I guess how because another way, the right, fusing together this anti-woke kind of thing, right? This is kind of more of the culture war stuff, and the left doing their whole woke speak. We're not going to have people on the right yelling at people on the left to make them stop doing that, and vice versa. To me, the answer is we need people from within each respective sides to say, hey, we got to pump the brakes on some of this, and we need to find better ways of getting this out. And so how do you, in your mind, how do you feel about, your Joe Manchins and your Susan Collins and your Mark Warners and your, is it two levels, at a political level, right, in government, right, certain senators, and then, I think just everyday people, right, when they're having conversation, be like, listen, I can't, I'm not agreeing with all of this extreme stuff or all of these kind of ideological things. Let's maybe find a middle ground. How do you think people can kind of do that?
I think, well, one thing is I think that people need to unite around the values, the best values of the American project and of Western civilization. And those are sacrosanct. And I will fight for those to my death, right? Like,
give a few examples of that for you.
So equality under the law, inviolable, that colorblind institutions, period, right?
Yep.
Limited government, individual rights, protecting individual rights. You get to live your life the way that you want to, as long as it's not hurting other people. And of course, like, we could get into, philosophical discussions about what exactly that means, but we know, like, pragmatically what I'm saying. Like, you get to express yourself,
right.
You can buy whatever type of car you want. I'm not going to say anything about it, or I might say something about it, but I can't do anything about it. If you drive that Prius, I'm going to make fun of you, right? But, so I think that, and I would say the same about.
For the record, I don't drive a Prius, everybody. I drive a Subaru Outback, okay? So I am total suburban.
No, the Subaru is a very respectable vehicle. So we need to be loud about being defenders of Western civilization. And that doesn't mean like some reactionary, Eurocentric, it's about like white people. No, it's Western, the principles of Western civilization. And I think the same thing for institutional pragmatism. You need to make that kind of sexy, right? And that's why I really enjoyed the Manchin tweet, the defend my butt tweet, which makes no sense, but brand moderatism.
Yeah.
Make that a brand, right? Because we're in this social media world where you have to brand that. So you say, look, like, it is actually cool to be a moderate. That's actually something that people should respect. And I'm going to push back on AOC, and I want somebody to push back on some QAnon, Senate candidate. Right. And I think so some of it is like the marketing aspect. And then I think there is, I mean, it's trite to say there's an empathy gap, but there is, and it is true that if you think about your local community, most people agree on most things, right?
Yes.
If you go outside and you talk to your neighbor, they want clean air, clean water.
90% of the things that I want. I mean, more or less. Right. Did my trash come today? Yours came, mine didn't. What happened? Oh, Did you see that sidewalk? And I mean, this is kind of the campaign for local government, right? Localism, right? Communities building that. But even when you branch outside of that, even at a larger scale, most people want the same things. I would
Right.
say in the basics, I would say.
Right. And so what is not helpful is when I look at, for example, a Twitter account where the entire content of it is just them and us. They
Yeah.
want to destroy you.
Right.
They're against your way of life.
Right.
They're doing lockdowns to gain just power and break your will. That is, first of all, it's ridiculous. And secondly, it's grossly simplistic. So we need to advocate, nuanced thinking and points of agreement. And okay, well, you disagree with this stay-at-home order.
Right.
I am favorable toward it. What's going on here? Why do we have this disagreement? Without imputing nefarious motives on people who disagree with us, right? And that is a difficult task, because if you just look at a tweet that says they're trying to destroy you versus one of my centrism tweets, and look at how many likes and retweets it's going to get.
Oh yeah. Oh, for sure.
So people get galvanized by, and they feel adrenaline when you get the anger going and the calling out the other tribe and calling out the elite. So I think that it's important to try as much as possible to dial that down. And I'm not super optimistic, but I do think that there is, with the rise of Biden, and you can see some of these Democrats like Alyssa Slotkin flexing their muscle a bit and saying, look, Rashida Tlaib, sit down.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Right.
You don't speak for the
whole
Democratic
party. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Like, no, we're not going, down that direction. Leads to destruction for us. Right.
Yeah.
And I think you really need the idea that it's spineless to be an institutionalist is wrong. It is not. What it means is that you're trying to make people's lives better, and people need to be, I think, bold with that.
Yeah, I think I agree 110% with everything you're saying. And I'll just give a small example. So, I live in Maryland. I live, outside of DC. I have friends in DC. I have friends in Baltimore. And, especially DC, it's very, very progressive, a lot of woke folks over there, which is fine. And I can tell you, I've had, for me, kind of exactly what we're suggesting, because I'm fairly moderate, center left, but, I have many conservative ideas as well, but, more or less centrist moderate. And when I've had conversations with some of my progressive friends, it becomes, if I'm not, and again, I'm not going to speak for everybody. This isn't everybody, but there have been occasions where I've been called whatever name you want. Oh, that's just misogyny. Oh, that's, bigoted. Oh, that's, xenophobic. Or, oh, and it's not, right? Because if I go and talk to 40 other moderates, they're going to be like, yeah, what's wrong with that? That sounds like a balanced, nuance, understanding complexities of the world approach. Or I'll get called a libertarian, which, it's just not true, right? I mean, so, and then on the other side, when I've talked to people that are kind of in this anti-woke camp, where, I mean, they just wake up and they just live for that, right? Yes. How can we, shit on the woke, and how can we just say they're, a bunch of lunatics, the whole thing, and I've had to, calm them down and say, listen, I hear you. Some of that has merit, but it's not on 12. There's not the coming, gulags and communism with a Biden-Harris administration. You got to stop with the sensationalism. Like, there's some value here. There's some truth to this stuff, and it's, again, pushback. You don't care enough. You don't see, you don't understand. You don't know what's coming, this and this and this. And it's like, no, I'm just having a moderate, balanced approach of, these are serious concerns. And it's the same on the other side, right? These are serious concerns. I care about racism. I care about inequality. I care about sexism. But again, because I don't care about it in the same way or to the extreme in which someone does. And then on the right, if I don't care about all of these other things that are, in the same way in which someone does, it's very easy, I think, for moderates to get, kind of drowned out. And I think it's a challenge for people to really just say, you know what, let's pump the brakes, let's sit down with this and find the nuance. I think that's just very hard to do.
And I think that's again an area where having kind of a pluralist perspective, I think, is helpful, because I just recognize that there are some people where the way that they weight their politics is such that wokeism is the primary concern that they have, and
right.
That's okay. I just don't share that as a primary concern.
Right. Same.
Right. And furthermore, I think with the issue with wokeism is tough, because when you're dealing with a broad cultural phenomenon and a broad institutional phenomenon, it's not exactly clear to me what politics can do to resolve that issue. Like, I share the woke concerns about the mainstream establishment media, let's say.
Sure.
The New York Times and the Washington Post are often despicable in their coverage of particular issues.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they do really good reporting, but they do often cover, like, say, the BLM protests in a way that's just clearly 100% congruent with the woke narrative. Yeah. The problem with that, though, is I don't know how you solve that politically, right? Mm-hmm. Having Biden as president doesn't make that better or worse. These are independent. In a liberal society, the media is not something that the federal government has control over, thankfully.
Right. So the control is the viewership, right? I mean, that's the control. Like, if you want to create change, I'm not saying people have to go out and boycott the New York Times, but they're at this point writing for what is going to get them viewership. And it's like, okay, if the things that are sensible get viewership overwhelmingly more than the other things, but that's just cultural change, right? How do you change people from saying, like, how do we focus more on, making moderate, sexy? How do you, that's a hard thing for people, because it's just not.
And that's one reason that I like the idea of promoting human progress and kind of Whiggism, mm-hmm. is because instead of trying to make what is boring sexy, what you do is say, look, like, life has gotten better. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are some reversals and some concerning trends like inequality, social solidarity, and so on that have occurred since the 1960s. But overall, if an individual was going to pick what time that they would want to be born, mm-hmm. they would pick right now over any other time in human history.
Of course.
Right? So trying to get that message out of this is how we concretely improve people's lives. And, that's what anybody would want for their children. Mm-hmm. More material affluence and abundance, greater opportunities, greater individual freedom and autonomy. You want your daughter to think that she can do anything that she wants to do. She's not limited by her gender. The same thing with, a Black child, an Asian child, etc., right. Native American child, whatever the case might be.
Right.
And now I notice I get a lot of pushback on that, though, from people who make this argument that you actually can't quantify well-being, or that actually things are not getting better, in fact.
I don't know what data they're looking at. I mean, you have to absolutely put your head in the sand on the, I could fill this room with all the data on it, all of the progress that's globally people have, studied this and understood this. Like, I don't understand where that's coming from.
Well, some of it perhaps is from people who just reject liberal individualism. So they would say that like the tribe or the group is more important than individual well-being, or having some existential struggle and meaning is more important than having 10 additional years of life. To which I say, your revealed preference suggests that you don't really believe that. Because if you really believed that, in the United States, you could form some group of like-minded individuals and build your own community and have these existential struggles or invade each other or whatever you want to do. It seems like mostly online cosplaying to me, where it's individuals who enjoy liberal society but have some real complaints about it, who then amplify that when they're on social media. But I think the average person, like if we talked to, our neighbors, or I go across the street and I talk to individuals in the apartment complex over there, and I said, hey, these policies will help you get more affordable healthcare and send your children to a community college for free. I think I could get them on board with that, and they would agree that they would prefer that to the alternative. Or, hey, if we continue doing this for the next 10 years, life will be better for your grandchild than it was 10 years ago. They would want that, right?
Right. And again, I think if you talk to most people in the world, or excuse me, in the country, that is, if you frame it that way, which I think is an honest, transparent, authentic way, I don't think people are like, you know what? No. Ben, I care about defeating critical race theory. That is the number one issue on my mind. We got to deal with that. I just don't think so. It's fine that you want to be, have some challenges, or in the reverse. Listen, racism is the number one issue for the country. And if, and this is how all of my claims, whatever the claims that many of the people on the left and the woke say, I don't see that. For most average people, it is, how do I have a job? Right? Go back to your example with the COVID lockdowns, right? Which is a complicated problem. Most people are worried and concerned about, am I going to lose my job? No one's thinking of, when you're in a crisis, or even if you're not, that's how am I going to have income? Because money and income represent safety and security in very tangible ways. How am I going to, what's everybody upset about? My kids aren't in school. There's some type of social decline. There's academic decline. There's higher, they're more depressed. They're more, that's a concern. Okay. Jobs, education, healthcare, right? Hospitals are overflooded. The ICUs are flooded again. Are they going to turn people away? How are they going to be able to get treatment, or stabilization? Like, those are the three major issues that most people care about.
Yeah. So there's I think an important concept that I'm going to take from David French.
Okay.
So this, I think, accounts for a lot of the reason that seemingly trivial cultural phenomena can take on an outsized importance. So he calls them condensed symbols. So these are things like, let's take mask wearing, for example. It's not, look, it's an empirical question whether or not they work. I think the best, most rigorous research demonstrates that they're effective and that mask mandates do in fact work to contain the spread of the virus, which that would match my priors, which is that if you have something over your face, it's less likely that you're going to spread
particles from your
right. So my prior would be that masks are effective. The research seems to indicate that. Why are we having a debate about it? Well, they become a condensed symbol of like some larger existential cultural issue to people. So instead of viewing it as a pragmatic issue of how can we contain the virus, people view it as, if you wear a mask, you're giving your liberty up. Right. You're bending the knee to the elite. And on the other side, it's, if you don't wear your mask, you're an evil human being. Right. You are MAGA. I wear my mask when I'm driving in my car by myself because I'm so fucking virtuous,
Right.
and
Exactly.
you're not,
Right.
right? And my mask even says like virtue on it because I'm, such a great person. And in that's very real. I mean, people have very strong emotions about that are sincere. And so part of the issue here, I think, is trying to make sure that these issues don't become condensed symbols. Like, and that's why I think not all Democrats, but Biden's instincts here, I think, are basically as good as they could be, where he just doesn't give these issues oxygen because he's not on social media. He's not, he just, you're a 78-year-old or 77-year-old white man who's just like, look, here's the deal, folks, right? Like,
right.
You care about, schools opening, about staying alive, about not having your grandma die. So he doesn't really play into and inflame passions and increase enmity between groups. Unfortunately, a lot of the people in the Democratic Party don't go along with that, including Harris, who's not particularly good at keeping these issues from becoming condensed symbols of what are truly important issues, such as freedom and wokeism and so on. So perhaps an attempt should be made to dial that back. And whenever you see somebody kind of entering the culture war arena, trying to kind of check that. And as you said, I think it has to mostly be people within their political party pushing back. Because it doesn't mean anything if Josh Hawley pushes back on AOC. It means more if it's moderates within the Democratic Party pushing back and saying that's not what we represent.
Right. Yeah. I mean, right. If Mark Warner's telling, AOC or Omar or whatever, like, listen, I hear your points, but come on, we gotta make sure that we know we have a good pulse on where the party's at. There's some of that, but that's not everything. Right, let's be more tempered on this. I think it has, that's just an example, but I think I think with moderates in the parties, respective parties, and then, with, I think, average everyday people. I mean, the cultural stuff has to happen with our everyday people. And I think that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have, I think it's the opposite. I think you have to have many friends on the opposite side of you. The opposite, you have to, if you're left, liberal, you have to have Trump friends, right? If you're in the MAGA world, have at least some moderates, have some people on the left that you're friends with, and you learn and you bridge that because you see where you're similar and you see, how you can help that. And so I think it has to be on that point too.
Yeah. And I would add, I think that there's an important component of civics education. So, because one thing that's interesting to me is how many people will tell me the Democratic Party is the party of AOC. She has the most power of anybody in the party. And that's complete ignorance. That's not understanding how legislation gets passed and the actual meat and potatoes of governance, right? In reality, even if the Democrats took the Senate, the moderates are in control because you need, let's say you win the two runoffs, like Ossoff and Warnock win. You need all 50 votes in the Senate to pass anything, right?
You got to see if it's going to come out of committee first.
Right, but assuming that you get the bill like out of committee and people are going to vote on it, you need to get literally every single Democratic senator on board, including Mark Warner, Kirsten Sinema, Joe Manchin. Okay, well, what kind of legislation is going to pass in that environment? Very moderate legislation. That's the only legislation that can pass, right? I mean, just clearly, because Joe Manchin is not going to vote for some socialist bill. That's not going to go down well in West Virginia.
Hickenlooper is not going to vote for a socialist bill, right?
Right. That's not going to happen. And so, and that's the reason that Obama, just by the way, wasn't able to pass a public option, is he didn't have the votes. So I
with
think
a supermajority, right? I think they had it was full Democratic. I know that, but I think it was close to it.
I was, in my scenario, even I was assuming that you had, this isn't even fair to do, but I was assuming that you had the Senate at 50 and you revoked the legislative filibuster. Otherwise, nothing's passing, period, right?
Right, yeah.
But I think the point is that there should be a recognition of what politics can do and what it can't do. And on most of the cultural issues, save for the fact that you can look to this figure as fighting for your tribe, politics doesn't do a whole lot, right? Like attitudes toward gay marriage, for example, there's a secular increase in tolerance there, regardless of what is going on politically, because that's just how this kind of stuff works.
It's the same with legalization of marijuana. I mean, it's like 15 states now. I mean,
yes, that is correct. Like there has been a secular liberalization of attitudes toward marijuana, and having a president who engages in anti-marijuana rhetoric is not going to do a whole lot about that, except for it'll probably polarize people's attitudes. So you would see, like, if Trump came out and gave a incredibly divisive anti-marijuana speech, like Reefer Madness redo, all of a sudden Democrats would be like, we need to legalize it tomorrow. And Republicans would be, like, oh, marijuana is terrible.
Right.
But politics isn't, I don't think politics is good at adjudicating those issues, right? It's for passing like concrete legislation. And I think, therefore, these cultural issues that are very important to people should be, as much as possible, settled at the local level. And I will, probably you will disagree with me, certainly any liberal would. I'm perfectly in favor of abortion being a state's issue, an issue that's settled at the state level. And I could be swayed, but I'm even somewhat open to the debate on gay marriage. Now, that's not happening because it's been settled by the Supreme Court, but I do take that localism reasonably far, because I think, look, if 90% of the people in the state of Alabama want abortion to be outlawed, I think that's okay. Why am I going to step into their community and say, no, you have to live your life by my values? No, there are certain things that are, sacrosanct that you couldn't, like life, liberty, etc. And maybe you could make an argument that that's taking localism too far. But I guess my prior is, let people live the way that they want to live. And only if you have an overriding interest do you impose from above on people. That would be my kind of default position.
I don't entirely disagree with you. I think in principle, I think that's right. I guess my pragmatic piece of this is, well, what happens when you have 50 states with 50 different values? Now, that's not likely to happen, but, then I think for me, it becomes okay, but, take the abortion issue, let's say, if someone, whatever scenario it is, someone wants to, terminate the fetus, at week 6, and Alabama is restrictive and says, no, we can't do that. Granted, most of the time this comes from some Judeo-Christian types of, nonsense, but let's say it didn't. How is that fair then to people in Alabama that don't agree with that and say, okay, what am I supposed to do? I can't just run over the border to Louisiana or Mississippi or Tennessee and get it done. I don't maybe have the resources to do that. So then my pragmatics start to get in the way, and it's like, well, that shouldn't be that difficult to do that for something that is, I think when you're talking about, someone's, being in their body, I think it shouldn't be difficult. But I do, in principle, agree So this is where like the details become difficult because it's
right.
I don't think there should be, you can impose with 350 million people across the big country, 50 states, 8 territories, whatever, the same exact value at the same exact, level. I don't think, I agree with you on that. I do think some of it becomes really dicey or hard pragmatically.
Incredibly difficult. Yeah. I'll take a concrete example. Suppose that some extremely fundamentalist Christian group in a particular county in, let's say, North Dakota, passed some blasphemy laws or passed laws that said if you use the Lord's name in vain, you go to jail.
Well, God,
would I be okay with that and say, well, that's just how these people want to live their lives? Who am I to say?
Right.
No, at that point, it's too bad you're part of the United States. But the devil is right. The devil is in the details there, and I do think that we should allow people to inculcate and instantiate their values at the local level within reason. And I think that's the kind of small L liberal project is what are the boundary conditions and the limiting principles there.
And I think that's the thing. I think that's the point of like, those are healthy debates framed in that way to have. I think that's valuable. I think that's, that makes sense. And, I think that's more important, I think, than maybe some of the other noise that goes on.
I think that's the thing that's amazing, isn't it? Like if you look at, let's say, taking Twitter as your kind of baseline for where political and cultural debate is, it's amazing how divorced that is from these actual everyday practical issues that people really do care about.
Absolutely.
So I suppose, maybe then, so I have about 10 minutes here. So maybe then, like, is there a way to move the debate toward more productive channels? That's an interesting question to me that I'm not actually sure of. It's like, how could we do that?
I think I don't have an answer either. I guess my two things that come to mind is, I think one is an exposure thing. So I think you were saying if we give less oxygen to kind of these big nebulous things or these really big abstract things like, misogyny or racism, like they're important, but like, how do we bring it down from the very, very, very abstract to kind of the very like localized, kind of small L ways of dealing with things? That's, I think, where, I think it needs to be just kind of recalibrated that way. So I think it's an exposure thing, right? I think it's, most people aren't really aware of it, but then not only is it an exposure thing, I think it's also of a participatory thing, right? It's like when I look at people, in my neighborhood, how many of them, there's like this unused power in a democracy in a local aspect that it just doesn't go used. It's like you have the ability to talk with, state senators, state delegates, all the people in certain districts, your county executive, like all the rest, going to town halls. And I get it. It's a lot of, extra work on top of all the other things they got going on, but that's not removed from people. And I think it's how do they participate in that, but how do they see it to be like, okay, I see that and that's tangible and that's what I can actually participate and do something with.
Right. And so I think that one thing is that people care too much about what's happening in faraway places and they're prone to like the nut picking, these kind of rich anecdotes. So for example, people are hyper obsessed with what's going on in Portland. I don't care.
I don't care either. I don't live there.
Give a shit less. Like if they vote in a communist mayor, great. If you like that and you live in Portland, do your thing, man.
Right.
As long as that doesn't, somebody doesn't get on a plane and come into Hillsdale, Michigan, and instantiate communist rule here, do your thing there. That's great. And the nut picking is, like the same. It's like, don't be so obsessed with one extreme example of somebody acting like an idiot in a grocery store in Seattle.
Right.
Unless it really is indicative of a broader concern, let's try to like not focus on that as much. Mm-hmm. And I agree with you, and this is something where I really have a lot of respect for Ralph Nader, because whatever somebody can say about him, mm-hmm. he really was good at tapping into the unused potential of a democracy and getting people galvanized and activated on very concrete issues like consumer safety, consumer protection, let's get seatbelts in cars and so on, right? And even if you disagree with him, you at least have to be impressed with the ability that he had to get people active, because
he could do it and then scale it, right? So he made it a national conversation, but kept it localized in many ways, or how it would have ripples outside of that, which was impressive. I agree with you on that.
Yeah, and that's where the kind of old school kind of bottom up Burkean conservatism, okay, well, form some institutions and organizations in your local community, try to scale them a bit, then start talking to your representative or your state senator or your mayor, and start to try to push these policies forward. But the politics now is extremely national, and it's very like Twitter, Facebook, and media driven. Those are the issues that are most salient to people. Like, it is infinitely more interesting to me that somebody threw a hammer through a particular local business in Portland than that the corporation, the manufacturing company down the street is polluting the river, right, in my community. And that's not, that is exactly backwards from how you would want it to be, right? That you should take an interest in that manufacturing company that's polluting your community, and you shouldn't worry that much about what is happening in Seattle or Portland or some hyper woke community in Los Angeles or something.
Yeah, I think it's just an absolute displacement of not wanting to do that in your own space. So, well, look, I'm mindful of your time, and I don't want to keep you too much longer. But just real quick, what's the future hold for Ben Winegard? What are you working on, and where can people find you?
So they can find me at Ben Winegard on Twitter. And I'm starting a podcast with my brother, probably first episode probably next weekend. Great. I think that will be a discussion and debate about his version of conservatism versus I'll push some form of pragmatism, and kind of see what the tensions are there and if there are any particular differences actually at the end of the day. So that's like kind of something I'm going to put a lot of energy into, and then working on reading about human progress, and probably polarization is a big issue as well. And then I'll just plug before I go my capybara content on Twitter.
Please do. I mean, if anybody hasn't seen it, it's fantastic.
Unmatched.
Oh, yes.
I steal it from other people, of course, but I'm a good curator of it.
100%. It's the captions. That's what it is. It's the captions that do it. It's what it is.
It is people do the hard work of uploading the videos. I steal the videos and then just take 2 seconds and throw a pithy caption on it. Usually, let's say 2 to 3 times a week or something, you can look for fresh KP content. If you haven't been exposed to it, I highly recommend it. It's bringing people together on both sides for the last 6 months.
It certainly has.
Through these perilous times, COVID, the re-election, the Trump coup, just always count on Cappy content.
30 seconds. Why capybaras? Why? For people who don't know, it's the largest rodent on the planet, I believe.
Yeah.
Why do you like them?
Really what happened was I loved guinea pigs as a kid. I just very cute, fascinating animals. My brother and I had guinea pigs through like elementary school. And then I went to the zoo when I was 16 or something, and they had a capybara, and I didn't even know what they were. And I just see this gigantic guinea pig looking thing. And I was immediately, that is my favorite animal ever. And I've been passionate about it ever since.
It's great. I love it. Well,
all right, thanks so
great,
much for having me, man.
Man, it was a lot of fun, and we'll have to get you back on here soon.
Yeah, we'll be in contact, I'm sure.
All right, man. Thank you.
Yep.